There is a sentence in the Meditations that stops you differently, depending on when you encounter it. Gregory Hayes translates it this way: think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. That is Book 7, Section 9. Marcus Aurelius wrote it in Greek, probably in a military tent on the Danube frontier, probably sometime in the 170s. He was not writing for you. He was not writing for anyone. The Meditations were private notes, a philosophical journal never intended for publication. The earliest surviving manuscript is a 14th century copy held in the Vatican Library. What you are reading, in whatever translation you hold, is a man trying to talk himself through a morning. And the thing he kept returning to, in nearly every book of those private notes, was death. Not morbidly, not with the theatrical gravity of someone performing philosophical depth. He returned to it the way you return to something you know is true and keep forgetting. The way you keep reminding yourself to call the doctor, to say the thing you meant to say, to stop postponing what matters. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the Roman world, and he spent 2 decades writing private reminders that he was going to die and be forgotten. The question this raises is not about Marcus. It is about you. It is about what happens when you do not do this, when you treat your own mortality as a subject to be deferred, an unpleasantness to be managed by not thinking about it. Because the research on what that avoidance costs is now extensive, and it describes a pattern you will recognize. But first, the men who wrote these texts, because the texts read differently when you know who was holding the pen. Marcus Aurelius was emperor from 161 to 180 CE. He spent much of his reign on military campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Danube. He managed plague, court intrigue, the betrayal of a trusted general, the deaths of multiple children. He wrote the Meditations during this, not in a garden, not in retirement, not in safety. In Book 4, Section 17, Robin Hard's translation renders: of human life the time is a point, and the substance is in a flux, and the perception dull, and the composition of the whole body subject to putrefaction, and the soul a whirl, and fortune hard to divine, and fame a thing devoid of judgment. That is not a motivational poster. That is a man staring at the facts of his situation and refusing to look away. Seneca was born around 4 BCE and died in 65 CE, ordered to commit suicide by the Emperor Nero, whom he had once tutored and advised. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He wrote his letters to Lucilius in the last 3 years of his life, knowing, in some sense, what was coming. In letter 49, in the Margaret Graver and A.A. Long translation, he writes, "Everything, Lucilius, is alien to us. Only time is ours." He was approximately 65 when he wrote that. He would be dead within months. The line reads differently when you know that. Epictetus was born into slavery around 55 CE. He was freed in his 30s, went on to run a philosophical school in Nicopolis, and taught the children of Roman senators. He wrote nothing. What we have was recorded by his student Arrian, the same Arrian who later wrote the best surviving history of Alexander the Great. In section 21 of the Enchiridion, Robin Hard translates, "Let death and exile and everything else that seems terrible be before your eyes every day, especially death, and you will never set your mind on anything mean, and you will never desire anything excessively." That is a former slave speaking, a man who had lived with the possibility of arbitrary death as daily reality before he ever studied philosophy. The instruction to contemplate death was not, for Epictetus, an intellectual exercise. It was a description of something he had already survived. These were not calm men in protected settings. Marcus was managing wars and plague. Seneca was navigating the court of a tyrant. Epictetus had been property. Musonius Rufus, Epictetus's teacher, was banished twice, once under Nero, once under Vespasian. The philosophy of death acceptance was developed by people who had specific, immediate reasons to fear death. That matters. It means the practice was tested under pressure, not composed in leisure. The Greek term is melete thanatou, practice of death, or meditation on death. The Latin phrase that descends from this tradition is memento mori. Remember that you will die. The practice is older than Stoicism. Plato attributes it to Socrates. Buddhist practice includes maranasati, mindfulness of death, documented in the Pali Canon. Across ancient contemplative traditions, the regular contemplation of mortality appears independently, which suggests it addresses something real in human psychology rather than being a cultural quirk. But the Stoic version has a specific and practical character that distinguishes it. Where Socrates, through Plato's Phaedo, used death meditation to argue for the immortality of the soul, the Stoics used it to argue for the urgency of present action, with no commitment to an afterlife. This matters enormously if you are a secular person over 40. The Stoic framework asks nothing supernatural of you. It asks you to look at the facts of your situation and respond accordingly. Here is what the texts actually prescribe, because the gap between what the texts say and what the internet says about them is wide enough to matter. In Book 9, Section 3 of the Meditations, Hard translates, even if you were to live 3,000 years or 30,000, remember that no one loses any other life than the one being lived, and the longest and shortest lives are brought to the same point, for the present moment is equal in length for everyone. Marcus is making a specific argument here. He is not saying that life is short and therefore you should seize the day in some generic motivational sense. He is saying that the length of your life is irrelevant to the quality of the present moment, because the present moment is all you ever have. Whether you have 10 years left or 10 months, you are always and only living now. The contemplation of death does not change the length of your life. It changes the quality of your attention to it. Seneca's evening practice is the most specific and actionable instruction in the tradition, and it comes not from the letters to Lucilius, but from his essay De Ira, on anger. In Book 3, Chapter 36, in John Bessor's Loeb translation, Seneca describes his own nightly routine. When the light is removed and my wife has fallen silent, for she is aware of my custom, I examine my entire day and go back over what I have done and said, hiding nothing from myself and omitting nothing. He then describes 3 questions. What bad habit did I cure? What fault did I resist? In what way am I better? Notice what this is not. It is not a gratitude journal. It is not a productivity review. It is a moral audit, conducted in privacy, in honesty, with the understanding that time is not renewable. The death awareness is the context, not the content. You review your day in the light of the fact that it might have been your last. And if it had been, you ask whether you would change anything. That combination, the specific self-examination plus the awareness of finitude, is the Stoic practice, not one without the other. If you have been trying to keep an evening review and it keeps becoming either performance or self-criticism, you are in the majority. Seneca's own letters on the difficulty of self-honesty are franker than the popularization admits. The practice is repetitive precisely because the avoidance is natural. Marcus kept writing the same reminders to himself for 20 years. He was not uniquely undisciplined. He was describing a human tendency that requires daily correction. Now, what happens when you do not do this? In 1973, A cultural anthropologist named Ernest Becker published The Denial of Death. He argued that the entire architecture of human culture, status, achievement, legacy, even romantic love, is organized around the denial of mortality. The book won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 1974. Becker did not live to receive it. He died of cancer at 49, 2 months before the award was announced. His line, "The depressing thing about the cultural hero system is that it eats people alive." Becker's work became the foundation for terror management theory, developed by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski beginning in the mid-1980s. Their research, now comprising over 500 empirical studies, investigates a specific question: what happens to human behavior when mortality is made salient, brought to conscious attention, and what happens when it is not? The findings are consistent and sobering. When mortality awareness is suppressed, when death remains the unacknowledged background anxiety rather than a consciously examined fact, it leaks into what the researchers call distal defenses. These are the displacement behaviors, hyper-identification with status symbols, compulsive acquisition, defensive ideological rigidity, increased hostility toward people who are different, and a particular low-grade anxious irritability that has no obvious cause because its actual cause has never been examined. You recognize these behaviors. You have seen them in people you know. You may have seen them in yourself. The sudden expensive hobby, the unexpected rigidity about things that did not used to matter, the irritability that arrives without an obvious trigger, the workaholism that intensifies right around the time the body starts sending its first serious signals. Under the terror management theory framework, these are not character flaws. They are mortality anxiety management strategies that were never consciously chosen. The existential psychiatrist Irvin Yalom, drawing on decades of clinical practice, describes a consistent phenomenon he calls the awakening experience. Patients who are forced to confront mortality directly, through a diagnosis, a loss, a close call, frequently report a subsequent shift, reduced anxiety, increased presence, a clarification of priorities that had been muddled for years. His phrase is precise. Death awareness acts as a catalyst for authentic living. The paradox is real. The contemplation of death does not deepen the dread. It resolves it, or at least transforms it into something workable. But here is where honest framing matters, because the alignment between Stoic practice and modern psychology is genuine, but not perfect. Terror management. Theory demonstrates the psychological costs of unconscious mortality avoidance. It does not test the specific Stoic practice, structured daily death contemplation with philosophical content, as a clinical intervention. The research on death acceptance, as distinct from death denial or death preoccupation, does show that integrated acknowledgement of mortality correlates with lower trait anxiety and higher life satisfaction. The convergence with what the Stoics prescribed is real. It is convergence, though, not proof. The Stoics were not proven right by psychology. They articulated something that psychology later found evidence for, approaching the same territory from a different direction. And this is where a limit must be named clearly, because it matters. Stoic practice is not a substitute for clinical care. If you are experiencing depression that does not lift, anxiety that interferes with daily function, grief that has calcified into something immovable, or trauma that resurfaces without warning, these deserve professional support. The Stoics offer a framework for the examined life. They do not offer a framework for psychiatric treatment. Seneca was not a therapist. Marcus Aurelius was not prescribing for clinical depression. The overlap between Stoic practice and cognitive behavioral therapy is real and well documented. Donald Robertson has traced the specific lineage, but overlap is not identity. One tool among many, not the only tool. There is another myth that needs correcting here, because it shapes how people receive everything else the tradition offers. The myth is that Stoicism means suppressing emotions, that the Stoic ideal is the person who feels nothing, the stone-faced operator who processes loss like a machine. This is wrong in a specific and documented way. The Stoics distinguish between propatheiai, pre-emotional responses, the immediate involuntary reactions that cannot be prevented, and path, full emotional responses based on judgments about what is valuable. You hear that a friend has died. The shock, the catch in the chest, the tears. Those are propatheiai. No Stoic teacher ever claimed these could or should be eliminated. What the tradition addresses is the judgment that follows, the belief that death is the worst thing possible, that the universe has treated you uniquely unfairly, that life without this person is not worth living. Those judgments are what the Stoics called pate, and those are what the practice examines. Not to erase grief, but to prevent grief from becoming a distortion of judgment that compounds the original loss. Marcus Aurelius wept. Seneca wrote with visible emotion about the deaths of friends. Christopher Gill, the classical philologist, puts it precisely. The sage does not become less human. He becomes more reliably human, feeling what is appropriate rather than what confusion about value generates. If you came to these texts after something, a loss, a transition, a diagnosis, a parent's death, a retirement that left a silence where purpose used to be, you came the way most serious readers come, not through curiosity, but through need. And you came at the right time, because the tradition was built for exactly this juncture. Elliot Jacques coined the term midlife crisis in 1965 in a paper published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. His clinical observation was specific. Between the mid-30s and mid-40s, there is a qualitative shift in the experience of time. Time stops being unlimited future and becomes finite remainder. The artists he studied, composers, painters, writers, showed a marked shift in creative style and thematic content around this age. Jacques attributed it to the first genuine encounter with one's own mortality as a near-term reality rather than a theoretical abstraction. The Stoics, read through Jacques, were essentially offering a daily training regimen for navigating this shift, not waiting for a crisis to force the encounter, but creating the conditions in advance. The evening review, the morning reminder. The line from Marcus in Book 4, Section 3, hard translation, think often of how swiftly all things pass away and cease to be. Not once, in a moment of philosophical mood. Often, daily, as practice. The word practice matters. The Stoic sage, the person who has fully internalized these teachings, is described in the ancient sources as rarer than the phoenix. The tradition does not promise transformation. It promises a direction of effort. Seneca did the evening review for years and still struggled with anger, with vanity, with the tension between his extraordinary wealth and his philosophical convictions. That tension is not hypocrisy, or at least not simply hypocrisy. Emily Wilson, in her biography, The Greatest Empire, takes a nuanced view. Seneca was a man genuinely attempting to live by principles that his circumstances made difficult. The letters to Lucilius engage this directly. He does not pretend the contradiction away. He writes through it. There is something in this that the 40-year-old, the 50-year-old, the 60-year-old viewer already knows. The practice is not the epiphany. The practice is the morning. It is the evening. It is the repeated return to something you understood once and lost in the noise of the day. Marcus wrote the same reminders to himself for 2 decades, not because he was failing, but because this is what practice looks like. If you read Marcus Aurelius at 20 and are returning to him at 50, you are meeting a different book. The book did not change. So here is what is actually available to you. Not as a hack, not as a transformation promise, but as a practice. Tonight, after the household quiets, sit for 10 minutes. No phone. A notebook, if you want one. Or nothing. Ask Seneca's 3 questions. What did I correct today? What did I resist? In what way am I better? Then ask the question the broader tradition implies. If today had been the last day, would I change anything about how I spent it? Not in a dramatic, cinematic sense. In the specific, mundane sense. The conversation you rushed, the thing you meant to say, the hour you spent on something that, measured against finitude, did not matter. Do this not once, but repeatedly. The repetition is the practice. The avoidance will return tomorrow. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the ancient world, had to remind himself every morning. You are not expected to need fewer reminders than a Roman emperor. If you want to go deeper into the primary texts, the Gregory Hayes translation of the Meditations is the most accessible in modern English, though it sometimes smooths over difficulty. The Robin Hard translation is more precise. For Seneca's letters, the Margaret Graver and A. Long translation, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, is the best available in English. For Epictetus, the Robin Hard translation, with Christopher Gill's introduction, is the place to start. These are not expensive books. They are not long. They repay rereading at different ages more than almost anything else you will encounter. I am curious which passage in these texts has meant the most to you, and when you first encountered it. If you came to the tradition in midlife, tell me what brought you. The comments on this channel are worth reading, because the people who show up here tend to have read the actual texts. The Stoics were not obsessed with death. They were obsessed with not wasting the life they had. Death was the measure they used. Seneca, in the last years of his life, aware that Nero's patience was ending, kept writing. He kept doing the evening review. He kept asking the 3 questions. When the order came, the blade, the opened veins, the final dictation to his scribes recorded by Tacitus in the Annals, he had been practicing for this his entire adult life. Not because he wanted to die well as a performance, because he wanted to live clearly. And death was the lens that kept the clarity honest. Subscribe if you want the tradition taken seriously, not sold as a poster. The line from Marcus, one more time. Hayes translation, Book 7, Section 9. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. He wrote it for himself. You are reading his notes. What you do with them is the only part that is up to you.